Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. Today we have another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is Heart-Wurms. It is our 24th deck in this series, and if you haven't seen what this series is all about before, we are randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100, and building a deck for Magic the Gathering in Commander around a theme of our chosen card. Now this week, our random card of the week is Advent of the Wurm. That's 1 green, green, white for an instant, and it puts a 5/5 green worm creature token with trample onto the battlefield. So to pair that, we have of course our commander, which is Saskia the Unyielding. It's black, red, green, white for a human soldier, 3/4 vigilance haste. As Saskia the Unyielding enters the battlefield, we choose a player, and whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, it deals that much damage to the chosen player. So we're able to cast Advent of the Wurm, make a big 5/5, and then have that 5/5 either hit two of our opponents or hit one of our opponents for double the damage, because Saskia, the way that she works is that if we hit opponent A and we've named opponent A with Saskia, then opponent A takes the regular combat damage, but also takes the additional damage from Saskia. So with that in mind, let's jump into some of our themes for this deck. Now the first one, you might have guessed this by the title of the video, is Wurms. We want to play a Wurm tribal deck using every color but blue. And to this end, we have something like Armada Wurm, which is 2 green, green, white, white for a 5/5 worm with trample. And when it enters the battlefield, we make a 5/5 worm with trample. So we really want to just churn out as many worms as possible, fill up the board, and then hopefully just kind of slam into our opponents, use Saskia, deal a little bit of extra damage, and go on from there. Our next major theme, because we have these massive worms are not cheap. They're all very expensive. They have a lot of mana cost to them. So we need to ramp. And one of the best ramp spells we could have in this deck is Mirari's Wake, 3 green white for an enchantment. Creatures you control get +1/+1. That's just kind of a bonus on top. What we really want it for is whenever you tap a land for mana, you add 1 mana of any type that land produced. So all of our lands now make double the mana, which is super useful when we're trying to cast big worms. And finally, our last theme is being able to double our damage, or being able to sneak through damage, or find a way to do extra damage on top of what we're already doing. So Rage Reflection, 4 red, red, enchantment, creatures you control have double strike. This helps us against creatures because we're able to first strike, kill the creature, and then hopefully our worm survives. But it also lets us do a bunch of extra damage to our opponents. Most worms tend to have trample or some form of natural evasion, so giving them a massive amount of extra damage on top of that just makes them that much more threatening. Now, to go along with our themes, we do of course have some signature cards or some key cards that we want, something we really want to play if possible. And our first key card is going to be Bellowing Tangleworm, 3 green, green for a 4/4 with Intimidate. So our creatures can't be blocked except by artifact creatures and or creatures that share a color with it, and other green creatures you control have Intimidate. Most of our worms are going to be green, which means that as long as our opponents don't have an artifact or a green creature, our worms are basically unblockable, which is incredibly useful when we have massive creatures that we need to get damage through to our opponents. Our next key card is Massacre Wurm, 3 black, black, black for a 6/5, that when it enters the battlefield, creatures your opponents control get -2/-2 until end of turn, and whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, that player loses 2 life. So this is a great way to clear out token strategies, any decks that want to go a little bit wider than ours, but it also sits on the battlefield and makes sure that whenever our opponent's creatures die, they still lose that life. So if we have to keep swinging in and they have to keep blocking to try to stay alive, Massacre Wurm is going to slowly drain them out of some of their life. And our last key card is Rhythm of the Wild, 1 green, red. For an enchantment that says creature spells you control can't be countered, which is very useful considering all of the worms are so expensive. And non-token creatures you control have Riot, so they enter the battlefield with either a +1/+1 counter or haste. Haste is great. We can play big worms, swing into our opponents without them expecting the damage, and then maybe if we don't want to do that, we can just make the worms even bigger. So this card really does a little bit of everything of what we're trying to do. And then, of course, as always, now that we're done with our key cards, we do have some cool interactions in the deck, some things that, while I was building this deck and putting it together and playing it, I noticed that seemed pretty interesting and unique, so I wanted to point them out. The first one is Dirt Coil Wurm and Rites of Flourishing. So Dirt Coil Wurm, 4 and a green for a 3/4. That says whenever any opponent plays a land, you put a +1/+1 counter on Dirt Coil Wurm. And Rites of Flourishing, 2 and a green for an enchantment. At the beginning of each player's draw step, that player draws an additional card. And, the more important piece, each player may play an additional land on each of their turns. So normally, Rites of Flourishing helps everybody in the same way. In this deck, we get the extra lands, so we get to ramp into our worms a little bit sooner. And if we have something like Dirt Coil Wurm, it's going to continuously get bigger. In theory, if each of our opponents plays 2 lands, by the time this gets back to us, it has 6 counters on it, so it's already a 9/10 creature. So it can become a big threat really, really quickly. And our second cool interaction is between Impervious Great Wurm and Garruk Primal Hunter. So Impervious Great Wurm, 7 green, green, green with Convoke and Indestructible for a 16/16 worm, which I believe is the largest creature in Magic the Gathering, at least base creature. And Garruk Primal Hunter, 2 green, green, green for a legendary Planeswalker Garruk, 3 loyalty. It can +1 to make a 3/3 green beast. The combo with Impervious Great Wurm, however, is the -3, where we draw cards equal to the greatest power among creatures you control. So we can have Impervious Great Wurm on the field, cast Garruk, immediately -3, and draw 16 cards. Pretty good, considering it only cost us about 5 mana for Garruk, and Impervious Great Wurm possibly only 3. So, definitely a useful ability. And of course, Garruk does have one last ability. It's a -6 where we create a 6/6 green worm creature token for each land we control. We're probably not going to get there very often. He's mostly going to be used for the card draw, but it is possible that at some point we get a bunch of lands, make a bunch more worms, and we just add to the worm tribal. And so with all of that out of the way, let's take a quick look at the price of this deck. So we came in at $95.17, so not the cheapest deck we've ever made, but certainly not the most expensive. And overall, the most expensive card was Worldspine Wurm, the 8 green, 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 15/15 trample. When it dies, you make 3 5/5 green worms with trample, and when it's put into a graveyard, you shuffle it into its owner's library. So Worldspine Wurm, super powerful, super strong, 15/15 with trample that makes 3 5/5s when it dies and shuffles back into our deck is an amazing card for what it does, especially for this deck. But if you are looking to cut down the price a little bit, get it to a little bit over $80, you can cut this out of here. It is technically just another worm, even though it is very powerful. So you can always find other worms to replace it. There's always plenty of them out there. So if you're looking to get the price down a little bit, this is cuttable. And if you've got one laying around and need a deck for it, this could be a good one. So the last thing that we need to do with this deck, we've looked at the price, we've looked at the themes and the cards. We need to see it in action. So we are going to play a game against 3 opponents. We're going to play against Veyran, Voice of Duality, Tanazir Quandrix, and Liesa, Shroud of Dusk. So Veyran is played by Bilal, and it is 1 blue-red for a 2/2. Magecraft, whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery, Veyron gets +1/+1 until end of turn, and if casting or copying an instant or sorcery causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. So Veyron is a very powerful commander, and from what I understand, Bilal's deck is not a storm deck, it's more of a token-based strategy, so we'll see how that works out. I'm interested to see what happens there. The next one, Tanazir Quandrix, is Shawn's deck for the week. 3 green-blue for a 4/4 Elder Dragon, flying, trample. When it enters the battlefield, you double the number of +1/+1 counters on target creature you control. And whenever it attacks, you may have the base power and toughness of other creatures you control become equal to Tanazir Quandrix's power and toughness until end of turn. So this is a +1/+1 counter style strategy. Definitely something to watch out for. I mean, our worms are big, but counters can probably outpace us eventually, so we may have to make sure that his creatures don't get too big. And last is Liesa, Shroud of Dusk, played by Jason. That is 2 white, black for an angel, 5/5. Rather than pay 2 for each previous time you've cast a spell from the command zone this game, you may pay 2 life that many times. Flying, lifelink, whenever a player casts a spell, they lose 2 life. So Liesa is a life gain strategy. Jason wants to try to kind of tax his opponents and force them to lose a bunch of life while he gains a bunch of life. So again, I think in the long term might be a bit of a threat for the Worms, but I think if we're able to get some damage on the board quickly, keep him from gaining a bunch of life, then we should be okay. But we will see how this game turns out, and let me know what you think, and I will talk to you all after the game. At the start of the game, Bilal goes first, followed by Shawn, Jason, and then myself. On Bilal's first turn, he plays a mountain. Shawn plays a breeding pool untapped, paying 2 life, and casts Llanowar Elves. Jason plays a command tower and casts Soul Warden, which gains him a life every time a creature enters play. On my turn, I play a mountain. Bilal plays an island and then casts Mindstone. Shawn plays a Fabled Passage and casts Merfolk Skydiver, putting a +1/+1 counter on itself, and he then cracks the Fabled Passage for an island. Jason plays a swamp and casts Syndicate of Tides. I play a command tower. Bilal plays an island and casts his commander, Veyron, Voice of Duality, gaining Jason a life. Shawn plays a forest and passes. Jason plays a Fetid Heath and then casts Kunaros, Hound of Athreos, and then attacks me for 3 with his creatures. On my turn, I play a forest and then cast Cultivate to put 1 land into play and another into my hand. Bilal plays a mountain and casts Reconnaissance Mission, which lets him draw a card whenever he hits an opponent with a creature, and he then attacks me for 2, drawing a card. At the end of turn, Shawn casts a Eureka Moment, drawing 2 cards and putting a land into play. Then on his turn, he plays an island and casts Herald of the Secret Streams, making his creatures with counters unblockable, and then attacks Jason for 2. Jason plays a Seraph Sanctuary, gaining a life, and then casts Kingpin's Pet, extorting it to have each opponent lose a life, and he gains 3. Then he gains another life from Soul Warden, and attacks Shawn for 3 with Kunaros, gaining 3 life when it does damage. I play a Sandstep Citadel, and then cast Saskia the Unyielding, naming Jason, so whenever any of my creatures do damage to an opponent, they also do that much to Jason, and I then attack Jason for 3, which makes him take another 3 from Saskia's ability. Bilal casts a Young Pyromancer, which makes a 1/1 elemental token whenever he casts an instant or sorcery, and then he attacks Shawn for 2, drawing a card when Veyron does damage. Shawn casts a Hydroid Krasis for 4, putting 4 counters on it, drawing 2 cards and gaining 2 life. He then plays a Forge of Heroes and attacks Jason for 2. Jason plays a Plains, and then casts his commander, Liesa, Shroud of Dusk, but Bilal counters it with Counterspell and makes an Elemental. Jason then attacks Bilal for 3 and gains 3 from Kunaros. I play a Plains and cast an Armada Wurm, which makes a 5/5 Wurm token when it enters, and I attack Bilal for 3, but he winds up blocking with his Elemental. And then, at the end of turn, Bilal sacrifices his Mind Stone to draw a card. On Bilal's turn, he plays a Command Tower and passes. Shawn casts a Reclamation Sage to destroy Reconnaissance Mission. Jason recasts his commander, Liesa, paying commander tax with life instead of mana. I play a Tainted Wood and then cast Rage Reflections, losing 2 life from Liesa and giving my creatures double strike. I then move to combat, attacking Jason for 20 with the double striking Wurms, which becomes 40 total thanks to Saskia. On Bilal's turn, he plays an island and then casts Izzet Signet. Shawn plays a Nissa, Voice of Zendikar, and activates her -2 ability to put a +1/+1 counter on all his creatures before attacking me with 14 unblockable damage. However, before the damage, Bilal casts a Teamer Battle Rage on a Hydroid Krasis, giving it double strike and making it so I take 5 more damage. This also makes him an Elemental token. Jason plays a Swamp, and then casts Shadrik's Silverquill, extorting it on cast to make each opponent lose 1 life, and Jason gains 3. Then at the beginning of combat, Shadrik's triggers, having Jason put a +1/+1 counter on each of his creatures, and I draw a card, losing 1 life. He then attacks me for 13 flying or menace damage, gaining 9 life and knocking me out of the game. On Bilal's turn, he plays a mountain and passes. Shawn casts his commander, Tanazir Quandrix, doubling the counters on Hydroid Krasis, and then activates Nissa's +1 ability to create a 0/1 plant token before attacking Bilal for 24. But before damage, Bilal casts Illusionist's Gambit to remove all attacking creatures from combat, untap them, and give their controller another combat step where they have to attack another player. This ends up having Shawn knocking Jason out of the game. Then, on Bilal's next turn, he draws his card, and unfortunately, unable to find an answer, concedes to Shawn's board, winning Shawn the game. Alright, so that was a pretty quick game. We wrapped it up in about 7 or 8 turns, and unfortunately, we didn't get to do much. As weird as it is, we only cast 4 spells that entire game, but even doing so, we still hit Jason for 40 at one point, thanks to Saskia and some double strike and a couple of Wurms. So I think that the power of the deck is definitely there. We definitely made ourselves look like a target, and I think that if we had survived for 1 more turn, we probably could have done pretty well. I had a Massacre Wurm sitting in my hand just waiting to come out, but not quite to be. Shawn's Tanazir deck just kind of ran everybody over, especially at the end there. So I think all the decks did very well and were able to perform pretty well. I know Bilal got stuck on lands a little bit, so that hurt him. But overall, I hope you guys did enjoy the game. If you're interested, you can always follow me on Twitter. That's down in the description. That's where I post all the new information about videos coming out and what else is going on regarding the channel and general other things. I also do take some requests for videos if you're interested. I have some actually in the works right now that people have requested in the past, so I'm hoping to get those up here pretty soon. And as always, please like the video, comment, subscribe. Let me know what you think. I always love to hear the feedback, and if you have suggestions for future videos or just how to improve the videos in general, please do let me know. And I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.